I still remember the day I walked through the gates of that mansion for the first time. People think gates are just steel and stone, but these gates, they weren't just physical. They were symbolic. They separated their world from mine. On one side, gold, luxury, arrogance. On the other side, me. Just a girl with a small suitcase, a simple uniform folded neatly inside, and a job letter in my pocket that said I was going to serve a family worth billions. The air itself felt heavier as I stepped inside. The driveway was long, lined with trimmed hedges so sharp they looked like they had been cut with scissors. And at the end of that perfect path stood the mansion, so tall, so polished, it almost laughed at me. But I didn't flinch. Not even when the guards looked me up and down as though I didn't belong. Because I knew something they didn't. I knew I wasn't there just to sweep floors or serve tea. The first person to greet me wasn't really a greeting at all. It was the daughter, standing on the staircase like a queen surveying her subjects. She was my age, maybe younger, but her eyes carried the kind of cruelty that comes from being spoiled her entire life. She tilted her head, gave me a smirk, and said, "So this is the new maid? She looks ordinary. Father, really, we could have found someone prettier." Her words were like needles, sharp and deliberate. But I smiled politely and lowered my eyes, pretending it didn't sting. That's the thing about people like her. They feed on reactions. Give them none and they underestimate you. The mother followed. She didn't even speak to me directly. She just waved her hand dismissively, as though I were a piece of furniture being moved into place. "Her quarters are in the basement," she said coldly. "Tell her to keep out of sight during our dinners. I don't like servants hovering." And then there was the father, a tall man with a booming voice, his presence filling the room like a storm. But he didn't look at me once. Not even once. I could have been a shadow for all he cared. He barked orders to the butler about his schedule, about the guests for the evening, about the wine he wanted chilled. And me? Nothing. Not a glance. Not a word. I thought to myself, good. Don't notice me. Don't even see me. Because that's when people make their biggest mistakes. When they think you're invisible. The days that followed blurred together at first. Long hours, endless tasks, the sound of heels clicking across marble floors, the smell of perfume that lingered in the air long after the family left the room. I scrubbed floors until my hands ached, polished silver that I knew they would never out us, and carried trays heavier than they looked. And every day, I listened. The daughter was the loudest. She had a way of filling silence with cruelty, mocking my uniform, my accent, even the way I walked. Once, she tossed her expensive dress at me and said, "Be careful, don't tear it. It probably costs more than your entire life." I wanted to laugh, but I bit my tongue. Instead, I folded her dress neatly, hung it in her closet, and whispered to myself, "Keep talking. Keep laughing. You have no idea who you're feeding your insults to." The mother was colder. Her cruelty wasn't loud. It was in the small things. The way she wrinkled her nose when I poured her tea, as though my very presence spoiled the taste. The way she gave me orders without ever looking me in the eye. Once, she snapped her fingers at me in front of guests and said, "Stand straighter. You look like a beggar. Do you know how embarrassing that is for us?" I stood straighter, but inside I thought, embarrassing? The day will come when you'll wish you had never noticed me at all. And the father. His silence was the loudest of all. He barely acknowledged I existed. When he did, it was only to command something, like I was an extension of the furniture. Coffee, papers, car? No thank you, no glance. Just words thrown like stones. At night, when I returned to my small room in the basement, I would close my eyes and replay the day's insults. Not because they hurt me, but because they fueled me. Every cruel word, every mocking glance, every order barked without kindness. It was all kindling. And I was quietly building a fire. There was one evening I'll never forget. A dinner party, with guests dressed in gowns and suits that glittered under chandeliers. I was serving drinks, moving carefully, silently, the way I had been trained. And then the daughter, with her sharp smile, turned to me in front of everyone and said, "Do you ever get tired of being invisible? Or is that the only thing you're good at?" The guests laughed. Not all of them. Some shifted uncomfortably, but enough. Enough to sting, enough to make her feel powerful. I lowered my eyes, set the glass down carefully, and said softly, "No, ma'am. I don't get tired." But what I didn't say was the rest, because invisibility is the best disguise. And while you laugh, I'm watching. While you mock, I'm learning. While you think I'm nothing, I'm preparing everything. They thought I was powerless. They thought I was poor, desperate, and trapped. But what they didn't know was that every insult, every humiliation, every moment they thought I was beneath them, was another stone in the foundation of their downfall. Because I wasn't just their maid. I was their shadow, and shadows see everything. It was late one night when I first noticed the locked door at the end of the east wing. I wasn't supposed to be there. Maids had their roots, their boundaries, their invisible fences. But sometimes I wandered beyond them, quietly, carefully, with my mop and bucket as my disguise. The east wing was different. It was quieter, colder. The lights were dim, and the carpets were thicker, muffling every footstep. That's when I saw it. A door, polished, with a golden handle and a keypad lock. It didn't belong to the rest of the house. It looked like something meant to guard secrets. I glanced around. No one. Slowly, I ran my fingers along the door frame, the hinges, the lock. I couldn't open it then, but I memorized everything. Because locked doors, they don't stop me. They invite me. From that night, I began to notice other things. A safe hidden behind a painting in the father's study. Filing cabinets with missing labels. Whole sections of the mansion that the family never entered when guests were around. Every time I cleaned, I searched. Every time I dusted, I looked closer. And then, one night, while wiping down the shelves in the library, I found it. An old photo album shoved into the back corner as if forgotten. I pulled it out, my hands trembling slightly. The first pages were filled with the family, lavish vacations, galas, celebrations. But halfway through, the faces began to blur. Pictures were ripped out. Others were scratched. There was one photograph where a woman's face had been carefully cut away, leaving only her outline. My heart beat faster, because I recognized the dress in that picture. It was the same one I had seen once, folded in an old trunk in the storage room, buried under mothballs. And then I saw it. The handwriting on the back of the photo. A name I knew, my mother's name. The album slipped from my hands, landing with a soft thud on the carpet. For a long moment, I just stood there, frozen. My mother, in their photo album. My mother, cut out of their pictures, erased like she never existed. I gathered the photos, shoved them back inside, and continued my work as if nothing had happened. But inside me, everything had changed. The next night, I returned to the East Wing. This time I wasn't just curious. I was hunting. I knew how to pick locks. It wasn't something I ever admitted, but in my life before this job, I had learned skills the rich would never imagine a maid could have. I knelt by the golden handle, pulled out a thin wire I had hidden in my apron, and worked quietly. Click, click, and then, the softest sound. The door opened. Inside, the room was an office. Large desk, shelves stacked with files, a computer humming quietly in the corner. I slipped inside, shutting the door softly behind me. I moved quickly, my eyes scanning everything. Papers, contracts, bank statements. Most of it looked normal, but then I found a folder labeled Private. Inside were documents, legal papers, old wills, property transfers. My fingers froze as I pulled one out. It was a will. An older one, yellowed with age. And there it was again. My mother's name. Her inheritance, her share, her rights, all crossed out, replaced by the signatures of lawyers, notaries, and finally, the father's own pen. I sank into the chair, gripping the paper so hard my hands shook. My mother hadn't been forgotten. She had been erased, deliberately, and in erasing her, they had tried to erase me too. I sat there in the silence of that secret room, surrounded by the stench of their lies, and for the first time, I realized why I had been drawn to this place. It wasn't just revenge. It wasn't just curiosity. It was justice. I copied everything. I used the tiny scanner I kept hidden in my apron pocket, sliding each page carefully. Contracts, bank statements, wills, transfers. I scanned until my hands were sore, until I had proof stacked inside the tiny memory card no one would ever suspect a maid to carry. When I returned to my room that night, I locked the door and stared at the memory card in my hand. That small piece of plastic carried the truth of who I was, who my mother had been, and what they had stolen from us. From then on, every insult from the daughter, every cold glance from the mother, every command barked by the father, it didn't hurt anymore. It fueled me, because now I wasn't just their maid. I was their undoing. They thought I was invisible. But soon, they would see me more clearly than ever. I had my proof, but proof alone wasn't enough, not yet. To truly destroy them, I needed the right moment. Timing is everything in revenge, and I was patient. I spent weeks pretending, smiling faintly when they barked orders, lowering my head when the daughter mocked my clothes, obeying when the father demanded silence. I was the perfect servant. Invisible, harmless, forgettable. And all the while, I was planning. My opportunity came sooner than I expected. The family was hosting their biggest event of the year, a charity gala with politicians, businessmen, and celebrities attending. The entire city would be watching. That was the night I decided everything would begin. The days leading up to it were chaos. The mansion buzzed with decorators, caterers, and designers. I moved among them, unseen, memorizing the guest list, overhearing conversations, noting where the family kept the files they wanted hidden. They had no idea that every whispered plan, every careless word was being gathered and sharpened like a blade. The night of the gala arrived. The mansion glowed like a palace, chandeliers blazing, music echoing through the halls. Luxury cars lined the driveway. Cameras flashed as the family posed at the entrance, smiling like royalty, shaking hands, waving. I watched from the shadows. My uniform was pressed, my hair tied back, my eyes lowered. No one paid attention to the maid carrying trays of champagne. But my heart pounded, because hidden inside my apron wasn't just a tray cloth, it was a tiny device connected to every screen in the house. The gala unfolded with elegance. Politicians gave speeches. The father boasted about his empire. The daughter preened under the cameras, and the mother glided through the room as if she owned the world. I moved quietly, refilling glasses, collecting plates, passing unnoticed, until the moment I had been waiting for. The father stepped up to the stage to make his grand announcement. A new partnership, a deal worth billions. Cameras flashed, guests applauded. He smiled, confident, invincible. And that was when I pressed the button. The giant screen behind him flickered. The company logo disappeared, and in its place appeared something else. Documents, scanned pages, contracts. My mother's name, her inheritance, the will they had destroyed. The room fell silent. The applause died. The father froze, his smile cracking. Gasps spread through the crowd as the truth unfolded across the screen. Page after page of their lies, their theft, their betrayal. Whispers turned into murmurs. Murmurs into outrage, the father stammered, trying to explain. The mother rushed forward, her mask slipping. The daughter screamed at the technicians. But there was no stopping it. Their secrets were exposed, their empire crumbling before the very people they sought to impress. I slipped through the chaos, unnoticed. No one looked at the maid now. Everyone's eyes were glued to the screen, to the scandal unraveling before them. I could have stopped there. That alone was enough to ruin their reputation, to destroy their standing. But I wasn't finished. Revenge isn't just about truth. It's about impact. And I wanted them to feel what I had felt. Fear, betrayal, helplessness. So I set my next trap. The day after the gala, when the family locked themselves in their mansion, desperate to contain the damage, I made my move. While they argued in the study, I quietly slipped into the office in the East Wing again. This time I wasn't looking for documents. I was planting something. The lawyer who had once worked quietly with my mother, to Thomas, and to several regulators I'd contacted in secret. I had been methodical. The avalanche I set in motion could not be pushed back with smiles. The father fled the stage. The cameras followed, the guests murmured. The daughter tried to pull the sheet of paper from my hand. Security flailed. I had the sudden sense of a live animal. Surge of adrenaline and clarity. The house could not shelter them any longer. They sued. They screamed defamation and called in lawyers who sent seduction letters offering hush money to everyone who had anything to do with my disclosures. They called my mother a schemer. Threats arrived in the night. They had hired people with good shoes to visit my old friends and coerced them to testify that I had always been unstable. The daughter's cries on social media painted me cruelly. The father made public statements about fabricated attacks on philanthropy. They tried to drown truth with noise. Tomas vanished from view for a few days. He'd been offered silence in the form of payment and a ticket away. He declined. "No more," he told me, voice rough. "I want them to see the cost." He believed, as I did, that some things in life are worth more than what you can trade for them. The private investigators, the ones who'd rifled the East Wing, kept poking at other houses now, sniffing around offshore accounts and vendor lists. One of them, a younger man with fingers stained by too many dirty ledgers, left a photo on my pillow one night. A picture of the father shaking hands with a man whose name belonged to a notorious shell company. I pressed the photo to my chest until my heart beat steady again. Evidence breeds momentum. Momentum breeds legal pressure. That is how empires fall, not in a night, but in 1,000 small defeats. But the real danger came not from them. It came from the unknown who had also been in the office the night it was ransacked. For days after the gala, we watched the house like a nest of vipers, and once, late at night, the daughter stood at my doorway, breathless and disheveled. Her mascara had run. She looked like a tiger who had been laundered into civility and found she was still a tiger. She stepped into my quarters as if she'd always had the right. "You started this," she said without preamble. "You think you can walk away and take our name? Our history?" Her voice was close enough that I felt the scent of her perfume like a slap. "You erased my mother," I said. "You had a vote in that." She laughed, a cracked sound. "It's not personal. It's business. You don't understand how the world works." "I lived in your world as a ghost," I said. "I know how it works. I know your maps and where your money sleeps, and that map will guide the truth." She raised a hand like a queen about to speak, then lowered it. Her shoulders trembled, but she kept her voice smooth. "Get out," she said. "Leave now. Take what you want. Take the house if you want it. I'll make sure you regret the day you crossed me." Her threat was petty, aimless, and dangerous. I watched her walk away and felt nothing but a curious pity. Then came the betrayal. The next morning, a short video appeared online of me in the gala, cut to make me look drunk and hysterical. Comments piled like rain. Her team had done what she couldn't do. They had smeared me. It would have worked on a scrap of courage, maybe even on a court who saw only surface. But surface had never defined me. I had already given copies of the evidence to people who knew how the law works. The regulators were moving. The lawyers were compiling case files. My small, stubborn coalition of past employees and new allies kept a quiet pressure on the firm. Whistleblower testimony, cross-checked transaction trails, auditors who refused to be bought. The daughter's smear was a pebble thrown into a pool that had already begun to boil. And then, in a move that proved how little they understood me, the father attempted to destroy the original documents. He called in a locksmith and told him to burn the East Wing. "Destroy the office," he ordered. "We can't have the originals circulating." They thought they could erase the past. They had not learned the mathematics of redundancy. I had copies. Thomas had copies. The library copy was out of the house. The minute they lit the first burn barrel, the lawyer I had given the cloud link to made safe arrangements, backups archived with timestamps, and a public release scheduled to send to journalists and the regulator if anything happened to me or the documents. The father's arson would become evidence of attempted obstruction. It was his perdition disguised as panic. When the flames took that office, because they did, the narrative shifted again. The story became arson, destruction of evidence, tampering. Fire was now on record. The investigators moved in, not with the vague brush of scandal, but with search warrants and forensic teams. That night, as smoke licked the windows of the East Wing, I sat on the library steps and watched the flames reflect like embers in a spoon. The house smelled of char and desperation. The father stood outside, covered in ash. The dignity he had once worn like armor now reduced to cinder. The daughter pressed a hand to her mouth and sobbed like someone who had finally been stripped of performance. The mother whispered apologies into a phone that stopped ringing. Tomas came to my side, dropping into the shadows. He looked older than ever. "We did it," he said softly. "We started the cascade. We started a reckoning," I corrected. When the indictments came, they came hard and fast. Evidence, meticulously gathered and cross-checked, dismantled their defenses. A judge signed warrants. Banks froze accounts. Regulators opened audits spanning continents. The father's philanthropic board resigned en masse. Sponsors withdrew. The daughter's name, once a ticket into every room, was now a cause for whispering. She tried to deny knowledge, claim she had been a pawn, a naive child in velvet. But the emails with her signature and the ledger entries with her initials told a different story. The butler, who had drunk too much guilt, confessed that he'd seen her in the study after midnight. The estate's bookkeeper, under protection, testified to forged signatures. Courtrooms have their own rhythms. I learned the cadence: facts, corroborations, cross-examinations. I watched as 12 strangers considered my life and my mother's with a kind of clinical curiosity that felt like mercy. I spoke truth, slowly, plainly. They listened. We won. When the gavel finally came down and they were convicted, years of prison time, restitution orders, the stripping of millions of dollars, it felt like thunder and a benediction both. But I knew this. Tribunals and sentences do not warm the nights when you feel small. They do not fill the pockets of the people whose lives were quietly siphoned away. Justice on paper is not the same as justice in life. I wanted both. The investors who had once rushed to clasp the father's hand came to me, quiet men and women in less glittery suits, saying, "Run it better. Run it right. We'll back you." I had not expected that. People who had watched the truth unfold saw in me something they had not anticipated. Competence. Integrity. A mind that could put systems together rather than take them apart. Here is the part of the story that surprises people. I did not take the mansion. I could have. I had legal leverage, moral backing, and the right in my hands. I could have stepped into the house that had been a prison for my mother and turned it into my throne, fired the family, redone the decor, given myself a title with the very currency they had taught me to despise. The headlines would have eaten it up. Maid turned queen. Revenge complete. Instead, I walked away. Not because I had lost appetite, but because I had learned something in that furnace of hate and fear. Power taken for its own sake corrodes the soul. The mansion was a symbol. So were their cars and their forged checks. I wanted to burn down the system, not inherit a set of gilded cages. I negotiated a different outcome. The assets the court allowed to be redistributed were not hoarded into my hands. Instead, I guided a plan that felt like reconciliation, not spectacle. We established a fund to compensate those the family had harmed. The long-term contractors who never received pensions, the cleaners who lost decades of wages, the small businesses who had supplied the parties and never been paid. We set up a memorial trust in my mother's name to fund education in the neighborhood where she had taught a few children before the family ruined everything. I insisted the new company board include workers' representatives, transparent auditing, and a public ledger accessible to the community. I demanded a governance structure where compliance could never be sidelined for profit again. They handed me a key, not to their door, but to their mess. They wanted someone to repair what they had broken so their faces could be scrubbed clean. I agreed on one condition. The new enterprise would be built to last, with people at the center, not profit. They called it naive. I called it necessary. They still wanted a face for the cameras, so the investors gave me a role that made the headlines anyway. Founder and CEO of a new company spun from the old, but not the same. It was not vengeance dressed as empire. It was a chance to rewrite the rules. Years later, the mansion stands, sold to a foundation that turned the gardens into a public park. The daughter, who once mocked me publicly, lives a quieter life. Some days I think she reads about a lecture at a university and wonders what it would be to live honestly. The father died before his sentence ended, hands cold, dignity gone. Thomas runs an office that audits charities. The butler found work commuting 12 blocks to a cafe that pays fairly. Small things, perhaps. But true repair arrives in the unglamorous places. People ask if I ever regret not taking the house. They ask if I watched the court cases, the fall, and felt hollow at the finish. I think about my mother in the photograph with her face carefully cut out. I think about how she once sewed a dress with slanted stitches because she didn't have a machine. How she taught children to read at the back of the community center after her day's work. I think about the quiet dignity of ordinary people, the way they hold their heads in the morning and go to jobs they never brag about. What I gained was not gold. It was agency. I reclaimed my name and my mother's story. I reclaimed the right to write what happened next. I became someone who stood for something that wasn't my name on a building, but a promise to make things better for the people who had always been invisible. That felt larger than revenge. On the anniversary of my mother's death, we hosted a small public event in the park that had been their garden. Children ran where limousines once idled. We opened the memorial trust. I spoke briefly, not as the woman who had been humiliated, but as the woman who had refused to let humiliation be the final chapter of anyone's life. When I finished, a little girl tugged at my sleeve and asked, "Are you a queen now?" She had a paper crown she'd made from the program. I crouched down and looked at her and thought of the daughter who had once mocked my uniform. "No," I said, smiling. "I'm just a person who will make sure people matter." She looked at me as if I had given her a secret. "That's better than a crown," she said, and ran off to play. That is the ending I chose, not because it felt moral in an obvious way, but because it felt true. People want spectacle. I gave them truth. They wanted revenge. I gave them reform. They expected a queen. I gave them a neighbor who makes sure contracts are legible and pensions are paid. Tiny, concrete things, steady things. If there is a lesson in this mess, and there are dozens, I prefer this one. When you are treated as nothing, the most radical act is to keep your humanity. Revenge is a bitter fruit if it's the only harvest you aim for. But if you use the anger to build structures that outlast the moment, the laws, the institutions, the audits, you change the system. You take away the illusion of invulnerability, not by spectacle, but by making the house stand open to sunlight. They told me I'd never understand their world. I understood it enough to know how it broke, and I stayed long enough to make sure it couldn't break others the same way. They thought nothing of me. That was their mistake. I knew how to listen from the margins, how to watch the seams. I learned how to stitch things back together, and if anyone wants to call that revenge, then call it so. But I prefer to call it justice that grows roots instead of smoke. Sometimes in the quiet, late nights when the office lights dim and the city breathes, I still hear the clip-clop of their heels through the marble corridors. I used to flinch. Now I think of the children running in the park and smile. The world is louder for the people who used to be silent, and I am glad I did the work that made that noise possible.